Hi, my name is Gina Larson, and I'm Vice President at Tri-State Adjustments. We are proud to share with you this video series regarding Regulation F. Regulation F is going to change the way debts are collected on when it goes into effect in November. It's important to us that we make sure you're aware of these changes, to know what's going to be different, and to just be sure we're all on the same page. We are excited to continue working with you and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
So this session covers the call frequency and communication caps that are identified under Regulation F. And obviously, we're going to be talking specifically about some of the ways that that impacts creditors. One of the rules that impacts debt collectors related to call frequency is what's referred to as the 7 in 7 rule. And that sets out how often a debt collector can contact a consumer. And the rule states that they cannot contact the consumer more than 7 times in 7 days. Now, there's a lot of complications with figuring out how to calculate that at times. So often they're looking at, no more than 7 calls in 7 days, depending on the account.
Yeah, and one of the things that also happens is if you do make contact, where you're actually having a conversation with a consumer, now you have to wait 7 days before you can have another call, unless the consumer authorizes you to call back. So it's become much more dynamic as to how often you can contact the consumer.
And this applies specifically to telephone calls. And so one of the things that's unique about Regulation F is that it has set out a lot of rules and guidance related to other kinds of communication, like email, text messaging, and other kinds of ways that your debt collector may want to be communicating with the consumer. And these 7 in 7 don't apply directly to email or text communications, meaning there isn't a specific cap that's put on those kinds of communications. With that said, the CFPB in the Regulation F made it very clear that if those kinds of communications become significantly increased, they may decide to put caps on that. And when looking at whether or not the call frequency might constitute as harassment, they look at all of those communications and contacts in the aggregate. So if you're trying to pepper someone with emails or text messages, it's not going to bode well for you. And so basically, the sort of thought is, let's not overdo those. Let's kind of maintain that 7 in 7 rule for the other kinds of communications as well, so that we're not basically getting that taken away at some later point.
Yeah, so for creditors, what's interesting is that the Reg F now kind of marries you much more to your agencies. So one of the things that happens on this communications and what Reg F is talking about is, say, for example, the collector calling the consumer at their place of employment. If you as the creditor had learned that the consumer had told you, don't call me at my place of employment, that information will basically be, under this new Reg F, imputed, if you will, as if the collector knew that. And that will then prevent your collector from being able to contact the consumer at their place of employment. So it's going to be a much more dynamic interaction that the creditors are going to have with their agencies with respect to those types of issues.
And that exactly leads into the sort of second part of this, which is the time and place restrictions that apply under Regulation F. So generally, this isn't a change, but generally, what the rule is that you can't contact a consumer at any time that you know to be unusual, an unusual time or place. And the time frame of that is between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m.
Where the consumer resides.
But where the consumer is, exactly.
Where the consumer is when they're getting that contact.
So the time zone becomes an issue, and figuring out when and where they are, basically, as far as when they can be contacted. And like Michael said, if that information is known to the creditor, that they've moved, or that something is known to the creditor, that is then now assumed that the debt collector will know that information. So it's really important that any of that kind of updated information gets documented and then transferred to the debt collector, because they're going to be on the hook for that later on if they call at a time they should have known they couldn't call at.
if you're looking at, you know, performance, key performance indicators, KPIs for your agencies, this is going to impact what they can do and can't do as far as contacting consumers. So you're going to have to think about how you integrate this into, if you will, your review of your agency that you use. But one of the things that you need to think about too is that's interesting, and your agencies are going to have to bring into the fold as well, is the state laws still trump Reg F, still trump the FDCPA. So, for example, Massachusetts has a more stringent, if you will, or a less frequent allowance of communications with the consumer. So we're still going to have to overlay all of that. So just be aware of this as you're working with your agencies, that their abilities to contact the consumers are being limited.
And that applies as well to if you, as a creditor, find out that they are represented by an attorney, that information must go to the debt collector, because they can't, under the rule, contact the consumer directly once they have information that they are represented by an attorney. So that's another instance where that type of communication gets limited to only communications with the attorney. Another big aspect of Regulation F that will have very significant impact on the way debt is collected is this idea of expanding the ways that you can communicate with the consumer, as I said before, both with email, text, telephone calls, which we've been doing. But with that, there's this aspect of the rule that requires the debt collector to basically accommodate the consumer with their preferred method of communication. So there's a lot more back and forth that's going to be happening between the consumer and the debt collector about how the consumer wants to be communicated with. They can say, I don't want you to call me, I want you to email me. I don't want you to text me, I want you to email me. They can choose the method of how they want to be communicated with, and then the debt collector needs to track that and follow those expectations or those preferred methods of communication with communicating with the consumer. And to the extent that that is a conversation that's happening between the creditor and the consumer, if they're, often creditors have those kinds of, what is your preferred method of communication? Again, that information should then be provided to the debt collector so that they can be continuing to follow some of those preferred methods of communication, assuming we have the right consent and right information to do that, and the debt collector stand.
Yeah, so a lot of that is going to impact, again, the creditors from the standpoint of the relationship you have with your customer before they're over to collections, and what sort of communications that consumer is given to you as to how they want to be communicated with, and consents to emails, consents to text. And just like we would get consents for TCPA and calling and be able to use automatic dialed and announcing devices and things like that, these sorts of things are going to need to be worked with to basically get the consents to be able to have these more robust communications. But in the end, if you kind of step back and look at this big picture, the Reg F is actually built in a lot better ways, if you will, to communicate with the consumers, and given your agencies a more robust way to be able to resolve your outstanding AR.